The sun dipped below the horizon as Emily, her brother Jack, and their two friends, Mia and Ryan, arrived at the edge of Blackwood Forest. The forest had been the subject of whispered tales for generations, a place where people entered but never returned. Despite the warnings, their youthful curiosity compelled them to explore the woods and uncover the truth behind its eerie reputation. Armed with flashlights and a single map, they stepped into the shadowy forest, unaware of the nightmare awaiting them. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves was replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to avoid the area. Their flashlights illuminated the twisted trees, whose gnarled branches resembled skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The path they were following started to narrow, and the air became heavy with the scent of decay. About an hour in, they came upon a strange clearing. In its center stood an ancient, hollowed-out tree with strange symbols carved into its bark. Around its base were piles of bones, too small to belong to animals. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Let's turn back," she whispered, but the others insisted on pressing forward, brushing off her concerns as overactive imagination. As they walked away from the clearing, the path seemed to shift. The forest began to close in around them, the trees now so dense they blocked out the moonlight. Jack checked the map repeatedly, but every direction seemed wrong. That's when the first scream echoed through the woods. It was distant, yet chilling, as though it had come from someone trapped in an endless torment. The group's pace quickened, but the forest didn't let them escape. Whispers started floating through the air, too faint to decipher but persistent. "Who's there?" Ryan called, his voice trembling. The only response was a low, guttural growl that sent them running. But no matter how far they ran, the forest stretched endlessly ahead of them. They stumbled upon a decrepit cabin hidden among the trees. Its windows were shattered, and the door creaked ominously in the wind. Desperate for shelter, they stepped inside. The cabin smelled of rot and mildew, and its walls were covered with crude drawings of eyes, hundreds of them, all staring back at them. In the center of the room was a table with a single object, an old leather-bound book. Jack opened it, revealing pages filled with strange incantations and sketches of monstrous creatures. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the cabin door slammed shut on its own. The whispering turned into a deafening roar as shadows began to rise from the ground, forming humanoid figures with glowing red eyes. The friends huddled together, their flashlights flickering wildly. One by one, the lights died, leaving them in total darkness. Emily screamed as a cold hand brushed against her arm. The others tried to pull her away, but an unseen force yanked her into the shadows. Her screams were cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. Jack, Mia, and Ryan bolted for the door, managing to escape the cabin, but the forest wouldn't let them go. The trees moved like living beings, blocking their path. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. By dawn, the villagers found no trace of the group except for a single flashlight lying at the edge of the forest. Locals claimed they could still hear faint screams and whispers at night, warning others to stay away. Blackwood Forest remained as it always had been, a cursed place where those who entered never returned, their souls forever lost in its depths. Deep in the heart of Ravenwood Forest lay a path few dared to tread. Legends told of a sinister presence that haunted the woods, a being that lured wanderers with whispers, never to be seen again. On a cold autumn evening, Mark, Anna, and their adventurous friend Chris decided to explore the forest, brushing off the tales as mere superstition. With flashlights and a sense of bravado, they stepped into the dense, shadowy wilderness. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal life absent. The air was damp and cold, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. As they ventured deeper, they noticed strange carvings etched into the bark of the trees, spirals, runes, and what looked like staring eyes. Creepy art project, maybe, Chris joked, but his laughter echoed hollowly. An hour into their hike, they found a small, overgrown clearing. At its center stood an old stone well, its bricks covered in moss. A faint hum emanated from it, barely audible but unmistakably there. Anna leaned closer, curious, but Mark pulled her back. "Don't. We don't know what's down there," he warned. Before they could move on, the hum turned into a whisper, soft, inviting, and impossible to ignore. "Help me," a voice called from the well. It was faint, yet hauntingly clear. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. "Did you hear that?" Anna whispered. Chris, ever the skeptic, leaned closer to the well. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though his voice trembled. But when he peered inside, the darkness seemed to stare back at him, and a sudden chill shot through his body. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping, pleading, and angry. The forest itself seemed to close in, the trees twisting unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky. The group panicked and ran, but no matter which direction they chose, they ended up back at the well. In their desperation, Mark tried using his phone for navigation, but the screen showed only static. Anna clutched her flashlight tightly, its beam flickering as if struggling against the encroaching darkness. Chris, now visibly shaken, muttered, "This isn't possible. We're trapped." Then the ground beneath them began to tremble. From the shadows emerged figures, tall, gaunt, and featureless. Their movements were slow but deliberate, as if savoring the fear radiating from their prey. One of the figures extended a bony hand toward Anna, its touch freezing her in place. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her away, and the three of them ran blindly into the forest. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the trees seemed alive, their branches slashing and grabbing at the fleeing group. Chris stumbled and fell, screaming as the shadows consumed him, his voice fading into silence. Mark and Anna, now breathless and terrified, burst into a small clearing where the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the trees. The shadows halted, retreating as if burned by the sunlight. They staggered out of the forest, collapsing on the roadside. The locals found them hours later, shaken and incoherent. No one believed their story, dismissing it as the result of hysteria. But Mark and Anna knew the truth. They had escaped, but a part of them would always remain in Ravenwood Forest, haunted by the whispers and shadows of that cursed place. To this day, no one who ventures into Ravenwood Forest ever returns. The small town of Ashford had always been surrounded by black hollow woods, a dense forest that had a reputation for being cursed. It was said that anyone who entered after dark would be lost forever, their cries carried away by the wind. Despite the warnings, 4 friends, Ella, Tom, Grace, and Max, decided to prove the legend wrong and explore the woods one fateful evening. They were armed with flashlights, snacks, and a sense of adventure, ready to challenge whatever secrets the forest held. As they ventured deeper into the woods, a sense of unease settled over them. The air grew thick and heavy, the trees looming like silent giants. their flashlights flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows on the twisted trunks. Every step they took seemed to echo, amplified by the silence around them. "It's just an old forest," Max joked, but there was an edge to his voice that didn't match his usual bravado. After walking for what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old stone archway, half buried in moss and ivy, like a forgotten gateway to another world. The ground around it was disturbed, as though something had been buried there recently. Tom, ever the curious one, approached it and placed his hand on the stone. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the wind began to howl through the trees. A faint, melodic humming filled the air, so soft at first that they almost thought it was just the wind. But the humming grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. It sounded like voices singing a haunting, mournful tune. The friends froze, their blood running cold as the voices seemed to surround them. "We need to leave," Ella whispered, but it was already too late. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, pale, gaunt figures that moved with unnatural grace. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their hands reached toward the group, their fingers elongated and skeletal. Tom backed away, but he tripped and fell to the ground. As he struggled to get up, one of the figures touched his arm, and a chilling wave of cold surged through him. His scream was cut short as he was dragged into the darkness, his body vanishing without a trace. Panicked, the remaining three ran, but the forest had changed. The trees seemed to twist and bend in impossible ways, the path they had followed now gone, replaced by a labyrinth of branches and brambles. The whispers grew louder, now clearly speaking in unison. "Stay with us, forever." Grace screamed as a figure emerged from the trees, grabbing her by the arm. Her flashlight dropped to the ground, flickering out, leaving them in complete darkness. Max pulled her free, but the shadowy figure clung to her, its hollow eyes locked onto her face. They could hear her whispers in their minds, begging them to let her go as her body began to fade, disappearing into the night like a wisp of smoke. Ella and Max ran, desperation pushing them forward. But no matter which way they turned, they only found more darkness and more figures lurking just beyond the trees. The air grew thick, and the voices became unbearable, until Ella collapsed to her knees. The figures closed in around them, their cold, clammy hands reaching out. Max reached for Ella, trying to pull her up, but as his hand touched her shoulder, she was gone, her body fading into nothingness. The last thing he heard was the sound of the forest, the whispers, and the haunting song that would be their final lullaby. The next morning, the locals found Max wandering near the edge of Black Hollow Woods, his eyes wide with terror, but his body was untouched. He couldn't remember how he escaped, nor could he explain what happened to his friends. He was the last to leave Black Hollow Woods, but the forest hadn't let him go completely. His nights were filled with whispers, and when the wind howled through the trees, he could hear their voices calling his name, urging him to return. To this day, the people of Ashford tell the tale of the lost souls of Black Hollow Woods, warning anyone who dares to venture too close that the forest always claims what it's owed, and no one ever truly leaves. The Haunting of Black Hollow Woods. One evening, 4 friends, Ella, Tom, Grace, and Max, decided to explore the cursed Black Hollow Woods. Legends said that anyone who entered after dark would never return. They ventured deep into the forest, where the air grew heavy and the trees seemed to whisper. Soon, they discovered a stone archway, and the humming of distant voices filled the air. Suddenly, pale, ghostly figures emerged, their glowing eyes locked onto the group. Tom was the first to disappear when one of the figures touched him. Panicked, the others ran, but the forest twisted around them, trapping them in a maze of trees. Grace was next, pulled into the shadows, her screams echoing through the woods. Ella and Max ran in terror, but the figures closed in, their whispers growing louder. Max tried to pull Ella to safety, but she vanished, leaving him alone in the darkness. The next morning, Max was found wandering at the edge of the woods, unable to remember how he escaped. The townspeople know the truth. Black Hollow Woods never lets go of those who enter, and the voices of the lost souls still call to those who dare come too close. The Whispering Pines. 4 friends, Liam, Sophie, Jack, and Rachel, decided to hike through the dense Pine Ridge Forest, despite the eerie stories that had haunted the town for years. It was said that strange voices lured people deep into the woods, where they disappeared without a trace. The group laughed off the warnings, eager for adventure. As they walked deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them. The air grew thick, and a chilling silence replaced the usual sounds of nature. Suddenly, Sophie stopped, her face pale. She had heard something, a soft whisper coming from behind them. The others shrugged it off, but the whispers grew louder, calling their names. Soon, Liam disappeared, his scream echoing through the trees. Panicked, the group tried to retrace their steps, but the forest seemed to change, with the path now impossible to find. Rachel was the next to vanish, pulled into the shadows. Jack and Sophie ran, but the whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent. In the end, only Sophie made it out, stumbling into the town at dawn. But when she spoke of the voices and the shadows, no one believed her. The forest had claimed her friends, and it was only a matter of time before it came for her too. To this day, the whispers of Pine Ridge Forest can still be heard on quiet nights, calling for the next to join the lost. The Curse of Hollow Creek. 3 friends, Aidan, Emily, and Ben, set out to explore the infamous Hollow Creek, a desolate area on the edge of their town. The forest surrounding the creek had long been feared for its dark history. Old stories spoke of a vengeful spirit that haunted the waters, claiming anyone foolish enough to disturb its peace. Despite the warnings, the group was determined to uncover the truth. As they ventured deeper into the woods, an unnatural fog settled around them, muffling their footsteps. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread began to wash over them. They soon arrived at the creek, its waters unnervingly still. The trees surrounding it twisted in odd shapes, as if trying to block their path. A faint whisper floated through the air, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Leave now." Before they could react, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and dark figures emerged from the fog. Their eyes glowed a deep red, and their pale faces seemed to melt into the mist. Ben reached out, but as he touched one of the figures, it dissolved into shadows, dragging him into the ground with a scream. Aidan and Emily tried to run, but the figures were everywhere, closing in around them. The whispers grew louder, now calling their names. As Emily looked back, she saw Aidan being pulled into the creek, his hands reaching for her, his screams cut off as the water swallowed him whole. Terrified, Emily stumbled out of the woods, but when she reached the edge, the fog suddenly lifted, and she found herself back at the creek. Hollow Creek had claimed them all. Now, she was the last to leave, and the whispers would haunt her forever, reminding her that those who enter are never truly free.